Good afternoon, everyone. What an incredible turnout. My name is Sarah Jesse. I am the Mary W. and Donald R. Clark Director of the Memorial Art Gallery. I'm truly delighted to see all of you here today. Thank you so much for coming. To begin, I would like to request the lighting of the ceremonial lamp. Well, I'm so pleased that you all are here for the Bridging Continents Exploring South Asian Art annual lecture featuring Dr. Darielle Mason. This afternoon's program is made possible by Dr. Vikram Dogra. Vikram is a distinguished radiology professor at the University of Rochester and the founder of the Dogra Art Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting and supporting South Asian art and culture across North America. We're very fortunate here at MAG that Dr. Dogra has such a passion for the museum. He has generously dedicated his time to helping us expand our outreach and accessibility to South Asian art and culture, and so we're very appreciative. In May of last year, Dr. Dogra helped bring Indian street artist Avinash Kumar here to create a mural site-specific in our Hurlbut gallery. And I would encourage all of you after the talk to go to the galleries and check it out. It's a pretty stunning mural. Furthermore, last year, we inaugurated the Bridging Continents lecture series, which is now in its second year. In fact, Dr. Dogra and his wife, Nelanie, are in the process of establishing an endowment to continue to ensure that this lecture series continues long into the future for years to come. In addition, Dr. Dogra recently donated the beautiful ceremonial Indian lamp that Nelanie lit earlier, as well as a well-curated selection of books on South Asian art and culture that are now part of the museum's library. And these books are on display in the pavilion, and we encourage you to check them out when you head there after the lecture for our reception. Vikram and Nelanie are also avid collectors of historic and contemporary Indian paintings, sculptures, and photographs, and we're very excited to announce, you are the first to hear, that next year in 2026 we will be showing a selection of that collection on view in MAG's galleries, so stay tuned for that. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Vikram Dogra.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. It's absolutely delightful, and I'm thrilled to see so many supporters of Memorial Art Gallery and Dogra Art Foundation present today. A special thanks to Sarah and her team to put this beautiful event together, and of course for the kind words she said about me and my wife. I want to thank special mention to some of the MAG team's members. First, Jamie Beers, then Melanie Fazio, and Chio, and Nancy for all their efforts, and others who are in the background who helped make this event possible. We are here today to celebrate art, a medium that transcends all differences, uniting us irrespective of our caste, creed, or color. The Memorial Art Gallery inclusion in top 10 list of museums on USA Today's list is a testament to the impact we can have together. Just to repeat one more time, if you didn't grasp what I said, that recently the Memorial Art Gallery was rated in the top 10 in the USA list for the museums to visit, and we are very honored. And that's all because of you. Thank you. Art transcends all differences. It serves a universal language capable of expressing emotions, telling stories, and bridging cultural gaps without words. This unique ability makes art an essential part of a human experience and a powerful tool for social change, and for that we have assembled here today. Now I am excited to invite Dr. Darielle Mason to the stage. Dr. Mason, please join us for the presentation of the shawl. This is something you may not have seen before, but this is a traditional Indian culture. And may I also invite Sima Ali and Jeremy Cooney to kindly come on the stage along with Sarah to present this shawl of honor. So now it's time to introduce our speaker. I am so happy to have Dr. Darielle Mason come from Philadelphia to us to participate in the continuing series of Bridging Continents, Exploring South Asian Art. And we could not have anybody other than her a better speaker, and I'm so happy to have her. Her topic of presentation, as you can see, is the sleuthing of the provenance of the temple, the mandapam they have at the Philadelphia Museum. And she's going to talk about it in detail. And she is also Stella Kramrisch named professor. And before I move on to introduce about Dr. Darielle Mason, I want to say a few words about who's Stella Kramrisch, because she is somebody who is very eminent in the field of art. She was from Vienna. She got inspired by Bhagavad Gita, and Rabindranath Tagore, the first Nobel laureate of India, heard her give a lecture in London and invited her to Shanti Niketan, a Kala Bhavan in West Bengal. And she served 30 years in Calcutta before she moved in 1950 to Philadelphia. And her contribution to the Indian art is unbelievable, and I encourage all of you to review her contributions whenever you can. This is the mandapam, the temple Dr. Mason is going to talk to us about. I'm not going to steal the show, so I'm going to just pass it by. I had the honor of meeting her in 2017 when I was accompanying one of the other eminent artists of India, Shri A. Ramachandran, a father figure to me, and Mummy, Chameli Ramachandran. She was named Chameli by Rabindranath Tagore. She grew up in his house, so that eminent she is. And here is my wife, Nalini. She looked a little younger at that time. And this is the book she is carrying, showing you, Krishna's Earthly Paradise, two shrine hangings from Peter Stan. Peter Stan is one of the very big collectors, art collectors of Indian art, very, very eminent, worthwhile reading about him. And we have this book with us. Thank you. She, Dr. Mason, did her intercollegiate in Rome in 1980. Then she moved on to do her art history bachelor's in Williams College. and she did her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and her thesis was Frame, Form, and Variation in the Maha Gurjara Temple. These are the temple styles from Western India, influenced by Rajasthan and part of Gujarat, and they have very unique features. I don't have time to go into it, probably she will. This is the Ranakpur temple, which is just at the outskirts of Udaipur, about 2 hours. And this is another temple, Ajinatha temple, and these carvings are very, very significant in this style, and that is her thesis, which she did in her PhD. She has curated more than 50 plus exhibitions, but I have just chosen randomly some which I liked, not necessarily in the order they were. So she did 1993 to 94, the Gods, Guardians, and Lovers temple sculptures from North India. It's available on Amazon. You can get it, read it. 2003, she did the Intimate Worlds of Indian Paintings from Elvin Obala collection. They are also available on Amazon. I encourage you to read and see. 2010, she did the Kantha, the embroidered quilts of Bengal. Those who are from West Bengal, you know that the Kantha embroidery and Kantha work is so delicate and so important to the region, and the book is also available for you to read in detail. And then Fulkari. How many of you know Fulkari? Fulkari, thank you. Fulkari is from Punjab. It's a very, very beautiful embroidery, and I think Dr. Mason did not leave any part of India. She covered from north to south, treating everybody equally. She has too many accomplishments to mention, but this one storied stone, the one she's going to talk about today, is one of her latest books, which is also available in Mag store. And Dograd Foundation has also chosen to give away 10 books today, and randomly we have chosen 10 names, which we will disclose in the end, and you can collect your book on the left-hand side. So 10 books will be given randomly. She has been collaborating and curator for South Asian art, Islamic Himalayan art, and complete reconceptualization of the Seattle Asian Art Museum. I do not know how many of you have seen it, but if you are in Seattle next time, please stop by and see. It's a wonderful place to see. She has taught South Asian art and museum studies at the University of Pennsylvania for number of years. She has, of course, authored this beautiful book, which we will see. She has authored Intimate Worlds of Masterpieces of Indian Painting from Elvin Bella collection, published numerous scholarly articles on Indian and Himalayan history, contributor to exhibition catalogs and academic volumes on South Asian art, and leads international research collaborations on manuscript painting and temple sculpture. From the leadership and institutional impact point of view, she has expanded the Philadelphia Museum of Art South Asian collection by selective acquisitions, some very beautiful bronzes and pitchwise, developed new gallery installations, making collections more engaging and accessible, strengthened the partnership of the institution in India, Nepal, and Bhutan for collaborative work, and mentored and advised many emerging scholars in South Asian art. Her contributions to the culture are innumerable, but she is an advocate of ethical museum acquisitions and cultural heritage preservation, supports initiatives for digitizing the manuscripts, paintings, and other arts for global access and preservation, works closely with conservators to restore and protect fragile South Asian artifacts, and honors an award, too many to count, but few, Alfred H. Barr Award of Museum Scholarship, then nominated for the Frick Center's Sotheby's Prize for Distinguished Publication, Academia Summer Arts Program Fellowship in Maine, Lamb Mellon Research Travel Grant, Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, American Institute of Indian Studies Junior Fellowship. Currently, she is involved as an art advisor, helping collectors, museums, offering expertise and mentorship, and providing consultation for strategic initiatives, including with a newly opened Museum of Historical Art in India. Darielle Mason is a visionary in Indian art. She is an expert lecturer and scholar, renowned for her insightful lectures and extensive publications on Indian art. Professional influence is obvious, active in numerous art societies, shaping the global art narrative. She is an engaging speaker, inspires with her profound knowledge and captivating presentation style. Let's welcome Darielle Mason with a wonderful round of applause and delve into rich tapestry of Indian art together.
I hope I can live up to that one. Wow. It is such a joy to be here, and I'm absolutely in awe of your community and everybody coming out today. This is really a special moment. I frankly did not expect this level of interest, and I cannot thank enough the Dogra Foundation, Dr. Vikram Dogra, Mrs. Nalini Dogra, and I am just extremely honored to be presenting the annual Bridging Continents Exploring South Asian Art lecture here at the lovely Memorial Art Gallery. Thank you to Sarah Jesse, the director, and her entire staff, especially Chio Uema, who has organized this and who's been just kindness and efficiency personified. And a shout out, as well as to all of you, to any students or faculty from the University of Rochester who are here in the audience. I hope this gets you debating a lot of issues after the talk. That is my ultimate aim. So let's get started. I'm going to start with a hot art topic. Should objects from formerly colonized regions, especially things considered sacred art or heritage, or just sacred, be returned to their places of origin, or should they remain in the public or private collections that own them now? On the one side, we have what I call the retainers. On the one side, we have what I call the returners. This camp is led by a large part by academics, by governments, and by the press, who argue that such objects belong only to the descendants of the makers or patrons. On the other side stand the retainers, led by collectors, dealers, and many museum professionals, who argue that these same works belong to all of humanity and should stay put for the sake of preservation and display. So we have two deeply entrenched, emotionally invested groups clashing over identity, ethics, and views of history. Does that sound familiar? What could possibly go wrong? And how can the ideology of each side be separated from their self-interest? In this case, their interest in ownership. One victim in this debate, as in all ideological battles, is nuance, subtlety. My primary question to you is whether every object that is today considered culturally important, having artistic merit, or sacred, was so from its very making. If we instead understand such definitions and designations as, at least in part, fluid across time, cultures, and even individual lives, then when do we ethically prioritize? When? What time? And what people? This, in the end, is the big question my research investigates. In our polarized universe, the very idea of fluidity, by which I mean nuance, gets seen as failed messaging at best and fighting words at worst. So even considering the reality of historical changes in perception risks the wrath of both the returners and the retainers. But here I go. Before diving into the quagmire of ethics, let's look at a whole lot of background, probably too much. Don't walk out on me. It'll be worth it. I use this, and I use this temple hall as a case study, as a lens by which to re-see this issue. So I'll begin with an overview of this unique museum gallery in Philadelphia called the South Indian Temple Hall. I'll introduce you to some of the many individuals involved in its acquisition, its travel, and its installation, as well as the interpretation of its stones over the past century. And I'll present a taste of the detective work that helped me reconstruct the stone's original location and use in India. I'll follow by detailing a key dialogue that took place between some folks in Philadelphia and others in southeastern India between about 1934 and 1943. This is a dialogue that, in my view, profoundly challenges our assumptions that heritage, art, and what is sacred remains fixed throughout time. The South Indian Temple Hall Gallery stands on the top floor of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. When you walk into it, you feel like you're entering a coherent religious space. Has anyone here actually been there? Oh, that's a lot of people. Excellent, excellent. So it feels like a coherent religious space, but in reality, it's a composite, an ensemble of 60 huge, separately carved granite blocks linked together in the late 1930s by molded cement. So like this is all cement, a lot of these pieces are cement, it's all over the place. From its first installation back in 1919 in Philadelphia, the museum always labeled this gallery that held these stones the Temple Hall, or the Mandapam, which is the same thing in Tamil, the language of southeastern India. As we now know, though, the stones had been found as loose blocks, and it was only once they got to Philadelphia that they were rebuilt to resemble a specific type of architecture. And from 1919 onward, many curators, designers, educators, and advisors have brought to the Temple Gallery, the Temple Hall Gallery, their own understanding of that architecture and their own vision of how the gallery should feel to visitors. I'm also part of that history. Over my nearly 30 years as curator of South Asian section, I made a lot of decisions, including on lighting, color, arrangement, traffic flow, and how the story would be presented in words and images. I also saw my own understanding of both the architecture and the audience change enormously over that time. Actually, I've been involved with this Temple Hall Gallery even longer, since I led tours through it as a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania back in the mid-1980s, and now I'm really aging myself. Although I returned as South Asian department head in 1996, I didn't visit the temple that these stones came from until 2004. I'd been in the city before, but I had never actually sought out the sites. During the following 15 years, between other projects, I built up information on the hall while in India and also while in Philadelphia. But it wasn't until 2020-21 that I had the time and opportunity to pull everything together and write and edit what became the book Storied Stone, Reframing the Philadelphia Museum of Art's South Indian Temple Hall, which was published in 22 by the museum in collaboration with Yale University Press. Now, there's a general assumption in our culture, and one I certainly swallowed in my formative years, that magic happens behind the opaque armor of the museum. That monolithic institution, the museum, that monolithic institution where the struggles of research and reasoning should remain invisible to the public. I've been uncomfortable with this anonymity for a very long time. Not because I want my name broadcast, but because, like all humanities scholarship, what curators write are educated guesses. And as we know, neither history nor art interpretation are finite practices. How can we, as museum professionals, help visitors understand that research never ends, that we'll never know it all, and that every visitor has the right to question for themselves? Despite a lot of talk about transparency, it's really hard to change old habits, especially in big museums. The museum continues to conceal the messy mass behind its armor, a mass of concepts, interpretations, expertise, prejudices, ethical stances. In other words, a mass of individuals. Museums continue to produce fully clad, perfect tableaux. And for fun, I'm showing you 2 Indian paintings that have nothing to do with the temple hall, but that I think highlight the idea of the armored illusion and the reality behind the armor. Now, on top here, I'm showing you the very first installation of the stones in Philadelphia as the gallery that opened in 1920. Below, you see the renovation that I led in 2016. Now, I certainly respect the reality of expertise, whether of a curator, professor, priest, or craftsperson. But studying the story of these stones has made me ask myself whether by trying to create an authentic and immersive experience in the museum, we're just fooling our visitors and ourselves. On the flip side, one thing that makes this gallery so special is that most visitors do experience the temple hall as unified and authentic. And in that, they get at least a semblance of an experience that they could only get if they went to Tamil Nadu itself. The experience in there for even many people intimately familiar with such temples continues. For example, after performing in the gallery, one of the most knowledgeable and thoughtful Indian classical dancers, Malavika Sarukai, said that she was aware she was not in the proximity of God, in other words, of the embodiment of the ultimate divinity that inhabits and radiates from a Hindu temple sanctum. But, she continued, the familiarity of the space transported her through memory to a state of communion with God. Even after all these years, I still get the urge to take off my shoes in respect every time I enter this space. That leads to thinking about what the function of a hall like this in a South Indian temple really is. Well, first and foremost, it's a place where God and devotee merge. Most Hindu temples are made up of a sanctum, a small chamber where the deity appears in their primary form, plus 1 or more halls where people gather or parade. These halls host what we might consider both religious and secular activities, although those aren't really separated. Priests and devotees ritually interact with God in various kinds of worship. They may also honor the divine privately by lighting an oil lamp or reciting a prayer. Certain life cycle events, like blessings for a wedding or coming of age rituals, happen here. And so do appropriate feasts, performances, learned lectures. And people also gather as a community, just to chat or to hang out in the shade and relax. This slide shows such a hall during the bathing festival of the great Hindu god Vishnu in his man-lion incarnation, one of his avatars or earthly incarnations. In this festival, the stone god in the sanctum, which is actually, you can't see it, it's got a curtain in front of it behind. The stone god in the sanctum has been ritually re-embodied into a portable bronze image so that he can be carried into the hall, where the priests bathe him with cooling liquids like milk and turmeric water, dress him in kingly finery, as you can see here, and show him off to his adoring devotees. By the way, this event, the one that you're seeing in this slide, happened in 2016 in the very same temple complex from where the museum stones were purchased over a century earlier. This temple complex is called the Madanagopala Swami, a very long word, which means enchanted cowherd lord, basically, which is another name for the young god Krishna, yet another of Vishnu's avatars. The complex stands in the city of Madurai, outlined in red here, in the state of Tamil Nadu, in the far southeastern portion of India. The style of its carving dates it to the mid to late 1500s, something confirmed by related inscriptions on the building and in the area. At this time, the region was under a dynasty known as the Madurai Nayakas, who were great temple patrons. The architectural elements in Philadelphia include, let's see if I can do this right, lion capitals, and lotus brackets. This is actually upside. No, I turned the slide right side up, so I think it's right side up. And a variety of elaborately carved pillars. Some are square-based, and some have these enormous mythological and divine figures emerging from one side. They're called composite pillars. And the final element that you see a little section of down here are slabs of stone carved with episodes from the great epic, the Ramayana, the adventures of Vishnu's avatar, the great king and hero Rama. These Ramayana segments in Philadelphia are set well overhead. The episodes that we see in Philadelphia, though, tell only parts of the narrative, and the sequence, as it's been reset in the museum, is all jumbled. It doesn't follow the story. The most surprising part of my first visit to the Madanagopala Swami in Madurai in 2004 was discovering there that there were more Ramayana fragments exactly matching those in the museum, but not matching any of the scenes that were in the museum. The fragments in India, though, had at some point been reset into the exterior wall of the central shrine of that temple complex. Seeing them there, right, if I can find my pointer, right here, was the beginning of my detective journey. The Ramayana recounts the incredible adventures, as I mentioned, of the hero god and ideal king Rama. Like all avatars, he was born in human form to restore cosmic order by subduing a particularly powerful anti-god or demon. For millennia and into the present, the Ramayana has been incredibly meaningful as a religion, morality lesson, political teaching, and entertainment. Its many episodes, such as the famous battle between the kingdom of the monkeys, has been visualized in innumerable ways into the present. And here at the top, you see a fragment that is in Philadelphia, and you can see the battle of the monkeys going on here. They're battling, and then when one of the monkey kings dies, he's overlaid right on top of the other, so there's blending together of different moments from the story. And then down here you see a manuscript where you have pretty much abutting pages where here they're fighting and here he's lying dead. So it's a very different way of telling. And then a recent AI animation that shows them in a very different form, but facing off fiercely against one another. Over the years that I was kind of back and forth on this project, I managed to visit many temples patronized by the Madurai Nayakas. The halls of these buildings are unique for their towering gods and heroes that emerge from their pillars. These temples, especially the greatest of their halls, constitute some of the most dramatic, monumental, and to me, absolutely mind-blowing monuments and combinations of architecture and sculpture in particular that happens anywhere in world art. I find it amazing that there's been hardly anything written about them or studied, or that they haven't become famous as tourist sites. And for many generations, art historians, connoisseurs considered them, quote, too late to study. So this is about 1550, 1560. Imagine, all of those things that you can think of from that period. Imagine the Sistine Chapel as being too late to be worth studying. Doesn't make any sense. That's, for me, a real reason to keep an open mind about that throughout time, there has always been value in art if you look for it. But I am preaching, I'm sure, to the choir. Let's just take a look at this so that you can see it. These are these enormous pillars coming over your head. And if you look at them from the front, they're just leaning out at you. And so you are engulfed in the gods, who are also the devotees to the main god in the sanctum. It's just an incredible idea. In looking at other Madurai Nayaka halls, I came to understand how the Ramayana relief that's partly in Philadelphia and partly at the Madanagopala Swami would have been set into an original architectural setting. I had taken photographs of the pieces in Madurai, and when I got home, I combined them with those in Philadelphia to see if, like a jigsaw puzzle, I could create the full story. I could. And with it, I could determine the layout and dimensions of the original hall. The Ramayana relief was a masterpiece when it was complete, was a masterpiece of storytelling. The architect, who would have been a learned priest, had re-envisioned, he'd sort of rewritten this huge epic so that it fit precisely into the spaces, into the requirements of his architectural format for his hall. And he had to retell the story from scratch. In fact, it's extremely unusual in this type of architecture to have a complete narrative set up around that ceiling space. Usually there's selections from a number of different stories sort of patchworked together. And as far as I've been able to tell, this is the only complete Ramayana within that tradition, or at least the only surviving one. The farther I got along with studying the architecture and archives, though, the more I realized how many pieces of the larger historic puzzle were missing. So like any good fictional detective, as I grandiosely imagined myself, I investigated. And also like any fictional detective, I wound up with a truckload of red herrings, clues that led me into all sorts of dead ends. And imagine sitting in your home office during COVID and bumping into a lot of walls. It was pretty frustrating. But the book that became Storied Stone, which had begun as a standard study of a museum masterpiece told in a standard museum voice, and had also begun primarily as provenance research to determine the stone's origins and prove or disprove the legitimacy of the museum's ownership, became, as I wrote, not only a thick case study, but also a critique of museum practice by an insider in the museum world. And looking from this perspective, one element that came into focus was the importance of practicalities. Thanks to most museums' expectations that they have to seem perfect to visitors and to funders, critiques from inside the museum remain rare. Instead, museum studies literature is almost entirely written by career academics, and often, not surprisingly, they can't see beyond the armor. This isn't a criticism, it's just a reality. I also came to reflect on what it means to be a US-raised, non-South Asian heritage woman working as a curator of South Asia's mostly religious art in a major US museum, a role that I've played for well over half my life. But I didn't write in isolation, even though I was in my home office in the middle of COVID, because during that time, our world changed, and we have to remember back now. It changed, and so did I. As crowds marched to my museum's steps in support of Black lives, I rethought questions about equality and power, and I felt empowered to release my own personal voice, to become more honest and allow my professional practice to merge with my own multicultural childhood and my living abroad in later life, my own encounters with colonial structures and prejudice, and my decades of grappling with the ethics of the art market. I made myself look at what it means for a so-called encyclopedic art museum in the US to own architectural fragments created as parts of religious structures outside of the European and American context. What I came to recognize, though, is that there's no single answer that fits all circumstances. Along with my own voice, I wanted the book to have a more holistic view, so I commissioned short essays from 4 different perspectives and used these to end each of the 4 chapters. The first is a family history by Bunny Coates and Eleanor Treadway, who are the grandnieces of the woman who actually purchased the blocks in India in 1913, as we'll see. Their contribution resurrects the attitudes of Philadelphia's white Protestant elite in the early decades of the 20th century. Professor Crispin Brandfoot, the leading specialist on the architecture of Madurai Nayakas, and especially of their halls, ends the second chapter. Professor Annalise Seastrand concludes the third with a fascinating exploration through mural painting of how images of royalty and divinity overlap. And the book ends with an essay by Professor Archana Venkatesan, who weaves her exquisite translations of Tamil hymns to Vishnu with poetic prose that viscerally evokes the emotional power of these halls. But let's jump back to see how the blocks arrived in Philadelphia in the first place. In late 1911, Adeline Pepper Gibson, on your left, daughter of one of Philadelphia's wealthiest families, and her new husband, Theodore Marshall, of whom we have no photographs, set off in their 2-year honeymoon around the world. After traveling across multiple continents, they spent a good deal of time in India. They first floated about on a boat in Kashmir, together with a grand piano and a portable darkroom, then visited archaeological sites, finally heading south to arrive in Madurai in March of 1913. The couple's first stop was the Meenakshi Sundareshwaram Temple, known by the British as the Great Pagoda. Although it's among the largest religious establishments on Earth, it had only recently become a stop for European and American tourists. And here on your right, I'm thrilled to have discovered a work from your own memorial gallery collection that shows Madurai and what it probably looked like right around the time that the Marshalls arrived. And you can see the Meenakshi Sundareshwaram towers appearing above the trees on your right. When the Marshalls got to the temple, it was night, and they caught the lit evening procession where Sundareshwar, the god Shiva as the beautiful Lord, in his silver palanquin, joins his wife Meenakshi in her bedchamber. The Marshalls were awed by the glittering spectacle. So awed that they came back the very next day. And while there, someone, we don't know who, mentioned a nearby temple where loose granite carvings had been thrown away. The Marshalls found this site. It was the Madana Gopala Swami complex. What they discovered there were elaborately carved architectural elements piled high and haphazardly within the temple's compound walls. Soon, they had selected 60 blocks, actually 62 blocks. We have a couple in storage. All large and some absolutely enormous, higher than this proscenium. They then approached the temple authorities and asked if they could buy the stones. Exactly who these authorities were is still not entirely clear. Some combination of trustees, priest, and patron. It appears that these temple authorities agreed to the sale readily, though. If written receipts were ever exchanged, which was actually doubtful, none have as yet been discovered here or in India. Fortunately, though, Adeline kept a travel diary, a private diary. Though I haven't been given access to the whole. It is indeed private, and her family keeps it such. Her family did let me see the sections describing their visit to Madurai. Unfortunately, her style, here at least, is very terse. She provides bare-bones accounts of her activities, but omits most of the names, titles, and details. What we can infer about the transaction from what she does write is that the couple didn't bargain on the temple's asking price. They just said yes. Nor could I find a hint, and this is key, that devotees or anyone involved with the temple considered this material to be sacred, although everyone knew it had once been part of a temple. Nor were there complaints made that about the transfer to America, which was widely known locally at the time. And there was no mention that it might constitute a loss of heritage, which really wasn't even a word that was used at the time. Loss of local continuity or memory. While this seems surprising from our perspective in 2025, the general practice in Tamil Nadu for over 1,000 years had been to replace deteriorating temples with newer ones for the sake of properly housing the divine and honoring the sacred site. In 1913, only the British archaeological community, and by that I mean the many Indian archaeologists who were also involved with that endeavor, only the British archaeological community bemoaned the demolition of a 16th century temple. And even they considered the blocks of such a building, the carvings of such a building, too late to be of any interest, historic or artistic. which was not the case for inscriptions. They loved anything that was written down, and they collected those assiduously. What concerned devotees were the stationary icons, the gods incarnate in stone, who had been awakened and permanently inhabit and radiate from the sanctum, and the most sacred space in the temple. Devotees were and are also concerned with processional icons, since that's where the stone sanctum god is ritually awakened in a portable bronze body to visit the halls in the city beyond. And here you see the stone sanctum image on your left and a bronze portable palanquin to carry the gods on your right in preparation for a procession. These icons are powerful and honored like the highest royalty. The rest of the temple structure, even architectural pieces with images of gods carved on them, are not, or at least were not, considered divine in themselves, but rather parts of God's shelter or palace. In southeastern India, at least through the early decades of the 1900s, these structural elements appear to have had value and meaning only when they were still in use on sanctified ground. Once they fell down or were taken apart and moved, such as in the process of rebuilding, old structural pieces lost their value and their power. Because stone is expensive to carve, though, structural elements were sometimes reused in other buildings. At other times, they were smashed into gravel for roads and railway beds. Occasionally, a special image, a special icon, would gain new and different life as an icon in another location. Adeline and Theodore completed their financial agreement with the temple. To be on the safe side, they even asked the British Archaeological Department for permission, though it wound up that this temple was not under the care of the government. Over the next few days, the marshals arranged for the stones to take the long journey to Philadelphia via train to South India coast, a barge to Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, land travel across Ceylon, a ship to New York, and finally transport by train to Philadelphia. It took actually a couple of years. Now the question is why? Why did this rich Philadelphia couple purchase an enormous load of carved granite in India and ship it home at equally enormous expense, or probably much greater? Neither the museum nor Adeline's family could answer that question, basically for a century. In 2020, though, I found evidence that the University of Pennsylvania's Architectural Archive held 1914 renderings of a country house that was being designed for one Theodore J. Marshall, Adeline's husband, by a prominent Philadelphia architect. But the archive was closed for COVID. I could see it on the computer, but I couldn't see any of the resolution. I couldn't tell what was going on. With literally days before the book was going to be printed, the archive reopened. Looking in person, the evidence to me was unmistakable. On the left, you can just see little pencil sketches of the figural pillars. And around this living room area, here, there's these strange shaped, sort of sticking out columns that are the figural columns themselves, where they were going to place them. And in other places, we can see, for example, here stuck into an outside corner, a pillar with a lion capital. If you didn't know the pieces, it was almost impossible to figure out what was going on there. In the 1910s, decorating with spolia, usually fragments of Greek, Roman, Romanesque, Gothic, or Islamic architecture, was a common practice among America's wealthiest families. But the Marshalls' intention to use ancient Indian temple fragments to ornament their grand house might have been unique, and so it would have been quite a social coup. But after the stones reached Philadelphia, They languished in a warehouse while a few things happened in quick succession. The couple's marriage dissolved, and the house was never built. And World War I erupted. Adeline and her brother, who was a doctor, funded a war hospital in France. Adeline traveled there herself to help as a civilian translator and secretary, but she never returned. In 1918, she died of pneumonia at the age of 36. To honor her, her family decided to donate what they called Adeline's Temple to either the city of Philadelphia or to the New Art Museum. The museum was then in its original Beaux-Arts home of Memorial Hall, a building constructed for the great 1876 Centennial Exhibition, the first U.S. World's Fair. The director of the museum at the time was Langdon Warner, an East Asian specialist and archaeology adventurer. Warner is probably best known for plundering the murals at the famous Buddhist cave site of Dunhuang in China, and as being used as one of the models for Indiana Jones. But he did recognize the importance of the Indian stones and convinced Adeline's family that they belonged in the museum where they could be, quote, properly looked after. Warner called this acquisition the greatest gift the museum had ever received. Spread across the museum's lawn, as you just saw, the florid carvings and strange deities became a national sensation, although press information wasn't exactly accurate. We mostly talked about a temple being taken down whole in India. To find out what to do with the blocks, Warner invited from Boston the only Indian art historian then working in the US, scholar extraordinaire Ananda Kentish Coomaraswamy. Although Coomaraswamy's father was from Sri Lanka, Coomaraswamy himself had grown up in England, though he had spent a good deal of time in Sri Lanka and in southern India, including Madurai. Coomaraswamy seems to have had no qualms that the blocks were sacred, and he was familiar with the regional practice of temple renovation and rebuilding. On your left is the museum's first installation, designed by Coomaraswamy to resemble a Nayaka temple hall. Standing within the large glass roof gallery in Memorial Hall, the figural pillars form a central aisle leading towards an altar-like construction. You can just see it down. Sorry, I can't see it. Down here. And on top of that altar-like construction, which is made out of the Ramayana slabs piled up, was a huge metal sculpture of what they then thought was Tibetan, we now know as Mongolian, image of the Buddhist goddess Tara. So Asia was being interestingly blended together. Along the sides of the room run the square pillars, as you can just see, interspersed with sculpture from across South and Southeast Asia, drawn from the museum's collection or on loan. Now, the museum considered the Gibson gift to be so exciting that in 1920, even before the gallery opened officially, they organized an enormous costume musing pageant, over 200 people, called the Building of the Temple. This extravaganza was in line with the amateur theatricals so popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. That said, the Building of the Temple undoubtedly constituted one of the strangest and perhaps most disturbing events that ever took place in a museum. It was an Orientalist mashup filled with misunderstood Hindu deities, Chinese dancing girls, a Maya priest who was acting as a prophet, and even a greyhound who stood in for the elephant that they couldn't get from the zoo. Storied Stone, the book, includes a rich description of this wild event, along with an analysis of its pretty obviously racist overtones. It not only homogenizes and makes nonsense out of Asia, as you can see in these newspaper photographs, but the dialogue talks very blatantly about an already obsolete ideology, that of manifest destiny, the inevitable spread of the white man across America and by inference around the globe. Although designed by Coomaraswamy, Horace Jain, the head of the Oriental department at the time, almost immediately began to worry that the new gallery was not correct or complete due to missing pieces. Though Jain himself had never been to India, it bothered him that visitors might not receive an authentic experience. And in part, this was because of Coomaraswamy himself, who'd actually visited the site in 1921 after it had been set up in Philadelphia, and brought back with him several photographs that showed a lot of additional carved rubble remained in the compound, as you can see all around over here. In 1925, the architect and architectural historian Fisk Kimball took over as the museum's director. This was, not coincidentally, the time when the city was building a new and larger home for the museum at a location called Fairmont, previously the city's reservoir, and you see that on your left. The first part of the new museum opened in 1928, just in time for the Great Depression. The building and installation, because of this, weren't completed until the early 1940s. One of Fisk Kimball's passions was to blend historical architectural environments with traditional galleries exhibiting painting and sculpture. Of course, he was an architectural historian. His plan for the museum, for the museum's upper floor, was to have intersecting architectural settings from around the world and from across time. Following Horace Jain, Kimball also saw the Indian Temple Hall as being incomplete. In 1931, he appointed as part-time Indian curator Professor William Norman Brown, a dynamic young, well, he was young at the time, not when this picture was taken, a dynamic young Sanskrit scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. Brown had partly grown up in India, spoke fluent Hindi, and studied images as well as texts. Just as Brown was preparing to leave for a 1934 sabbatical in India, Kimball asked him to add Madurai to his itinerary. The director wanted Brown to accomplish two tasks: confirm that Philadelphia's stones were organized, quote, authentically, and purchase enough additional carvings from the remaining rubble to, quote, complete the installation adequately. But to frame the key 1934 to 1943 dialogue that I mentioned earlier, we still need to understand the origin of the blocks themselves, so bear with me a little longer. Something that's been an even more long and confusing detective story than reconstructing the Ramayana relief. The big question was, were the stones part of the Madanagopalaswamy complex where they had been found, or did they come from somewhere else? Back in 1934, Brown had recognized, when he visited the site, that the forms of many of the Philadelphia carvings, particularly the figural pillars, wouldn't have fit anywhere inside the present compound walls. And that was his plan of it. You see, on the left, the small Madanagopalaswamy lies very near a much larger Vishnu temple called the Kudal Alagar. And here you can see the Kudal Alagar's towers, how close they are to the Madanagopalaswamy complex, just peeking right over the walls. The Kudal Alagar is one of the Divya Desham, the 108 Vishnu temples praised by a group of ancient poet saints. Many of these temples are said to date to the Sangam era, which is late BC to very early AD. However, the practice of frequent temple rebuilding means that there's very little architectural fabric that can be concretely dated to that time, especially in Madurai. The various parts of the Kudal Aligarh complex had been rebuilt over the past millennium, including by the Madurai Nayakas in the late 16th century. And that's the same time that the Madanagopalaswamy had been completely rebuilt and pretty much stands today as a 16th century monument, although it also has history that dates it much later. Here you see how close the two temples stand. The Madanagopalaswamy is marked with the green star, and the Kudal Aligarh with the red. And there's a lot of city fabric that's built up in between, but that's actually only spitting distance away. It's like a block. Now here's the crucial piece. In the southeast sector of the Kudal Aligarh, there stands a large sub-shrine dedicated to Vishnu's wife, known locally as the goddess Madhuravali. Brown found this shrine and suspected that the pieces might come from here. With help from specialist colleagues, including epigraphist Crispin Branfoot, architectural historian, and epigraphist Leslie Orr, I found out that the 16th century fabric of the goddess shrine had fallen into disrepair, and in late 1907, so before Brown's visit and before the Marshal's visit, the entire building had been taken down in preparation for replacing it with an up-to-date shrine that would properly house the goddess. This project was funded by a wealthy donor, one Mutu KRV Alagappa Chettiar. As his name Chettiar shows, he came from the Chettiar community, specifically the elite Natukatai Chettiars. The Chettiars are a merchant clan that made enormous fortunes in Southeast Asia, especially Singapore in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and spent much of their fortunes back home, constructing palatial houses like the one you see on the right, and piously renovating and building temples to Vishnu, as well as to Shiva and other Hindu deities across Tamil Nadu and across Sri Lanka. The leftover blocks from the demolished Kudal Aligarh goddess shrine were therefore, as we now know, carted across the street or around the block and piled within the, at that point, unused Madanagopalaswamy compound, to be found there by Adeline and Theodore in early 1913. So the transfer of the blocks must have taken place between 1908 and 1912. The new, as they called it, goddess shrine was built in what was termed at that point modern style. In these details, for example, you can see a British-style flower pot and a very heraldic, non-Indian looking lion. It was completed and dedicated in 1923 and follows a ground plan typical of Chettiar patronized temples. The elegant dark stone structure entirely covers up the footprint of the 16th century Nayaka shrine it replaced, so we can't tell what that looked like. It's logical, though not documented, that the money the Marshals paid for the discarded stones went into this rebuilding project. So Director Fitzgibbon sent Brown to Madurai to get a straight scoop on how the stones should be arranged to make the museum hall as true to the architecture, as authentic as possible. But the director's primary aim was for Brown to buy more carved stones to complete the installation even better. When Brown arrived in India, he wrote to F.H. Gravely, who was the director of the Madras Museum, the city that is now Chennai, requesting Gravely, his old friend, and asking him for another old friend, the curator of archaeology, T.N. Ramachandran, to accompany him to Madurai. But Ramachandran was down with dengue fever, which is very grave. And Gravely decided, no pun intended, to substitute T.G. Aravamutan, a lawyer who had made himself into an historian, archaeologist, and numismatist, someone who studies coins, gravely convinced Brown that Aravamutan, whom you see on the right, was a perfect companion in part because of his identity as a high caste devotee of Vishnu, who already knew many of the temple trustees in Madurai and who could access religious structures that Brown, as a foreigner and a non-Hindu, wouldn't even be allowed to enter. Aravamutan's legal training, historical knowledge, and of course, fluency in English and Tamil would also be invaluable. It's worth noting that both the Madanagopalaswamy and the Kudal Alakar were always controlled by the same management. And this is a sort of kind of corporate structure. At the time of Adeline's visit, this consisted of locally appointed devotee trustees. And this is a really important point. At the time, but in 1927, and so by the time of Brown's visit in 1934, the legal status of Hindu temple management in Tamil Nadu had been changed by the government. And now a trustee was appointed by the British government to run the show, although that individual was still a Hindu and still of Indian origin. It's actually a very controversial issue even today. In their first few days in Madurai, Brown, Aravamutan, and an unnamed draftsman found that a much larger than expected number of loose carved elements remained scattered around the Madanagopalaswamy complex, more than even Kramrisch's 1921 photos had indicated. They also figured out an astonishing amount about the original layout of the temple and decided it couldn't be the place where most of the loose stones had come from. Most significantly, they developed a new theory, as I mentioned, on where the majority of the Philadelphia blocks came from. But they were speculating, they couldn't prove that these were part of the dismantled 16th century goddess temple in the Kudal Alagar. They didn't have all of the information that we've been able to gather later. Brown sent Kimball a long report on his findings, including alternatives for reinstalling the museum's temple hall gallery with the additional blocks he intended to purchase. Although Brown warned that, quote, "Our rearrangement shall not reproduce anything that ever actually existed, but we shall be able to present something that might plausibly have existed." And this is interesting when you think about museums that you go into, and especially when you think about spaces that are recreated architecture. What are you seeing? The museum wanted the deal closed before Brown left India that year. So Aravamutan immediately began negotiations with the government-appointed trustee. Brown asked Aravamutan to keep silent on the fact that the blocks would go to America, not because they were sacred or illegal, but because he feared that it would increase the asking price. Back in Philadelphia, Kimball had already raised more than enough money from patrons. So by 1935, everything appeared to be in place for the purchase and the shipping. But Aravamutan couldn't bring the trustees to the point of agreeing to the sale. Brown reported to Kimball that the negotiations were, quote, "as delicate as a royal marriage." And negotiations dragged on for over a decade. While this disappointed Kimball, it resulted in a correspondence that provides us with a rare glimpse into the subtle changes in definitions of sacrality, authenticity, heritage, and ownership that were happening at the time in Madurai and Philadelphia, and that we can really use as a case study to think about these issues. Aravamutan has long been dismissed in this country, and even in India, as just Brown's Indian helper. But I came to see his role as central to this story and very complicated. While not overly political, his own scholarship, which is excellent, includes propounding the Tamil origins of South India's oldest civilization, and his work reflects that he held an ideology of Tamil or South Indian superiority, and was in solidarity with the political cultural independence movement active in the Madras Presidency, which is what the region was called, and of course, across South Asia at the time, and the movement against the British, or against British colonial power. In his first letter to Brown, Aravamutin said that the local temple trustee was, quote, afraid public censure might fall on him for selling temple property, even though he should sell it honestly. A year or so later, Aravamutin wrote again, now saying that the trustee was willing to sell, but that the local worshippers wanted to renovate the Madanagopala Swami's collapsed North Shrine, and that a wealthy devotee had just gotten involved. Aravamutin asked that the museum give the worshippers more time to see if they could raise enough money for this renovation and also repurpose older pieces into a small shrine or shrines around the compound. If they couldn't raise enough money for the central shrine, the trustee thought that the devotees would want to sell the fragments to subsidize the major renovation. Yet another year passed. When Brown asked again, Aravamutin repeated that the trustee needed more time. In my reading of the letters, Aravamutin's split loyalties show between the lines. In 1938, Brown finally wrote to Kimball saying, in recent years, a great deal of feeling has arisen in India against selling any sort of antiquities from temples, especially to non-Hindus. The museum had also run out of time. Using Brown's basic design, they finally installed a gallery with the pieces that they did own, substituting the faux finished cement that I pointed at the beginning for the supposedly missing blocks. The Oriental Wing, as it was called, opened in 1940, and to the left is a view going into the wing, and on the right is one of the side shrines at the Madanagopala Swami with a much later renovated roof that they actually copied precisely in Philadelphia. Also in 1940, the University of Pennsylvania published Brown's book, A Pillared Hall from a Temple at Madurai in India, in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And that should have been that. But in 1943, so 3 years after these pieces opened in Philadelphia, Brown asked Gravely, who had recently retired from the Madras Museum, if additional blocks might still be forthcoming. Gravely actually went to Madurai, but what he found at the Madanagopala Swami temple was that the fragments of the Ramayana, the pieces that the museum most wanted to complete, had just been rebuilt into the Madanagopala Swami's own central shrine wall. And here you can see how part of the bottom of the wall was actually cut away and put up above to fit in these fragments that were dug into the wall and replaced, or not replaced, placed there for the first time. But many other pieces, especially pillars and brackets, remained lying about the compound even as late as 2008 to 10. Gravely, unlike the lawyer Aravamutin, must have shown the trustees images of the Philadelphia stones, probably in Brown's 1940 book. Not surprisingly, the trustee requested that Philadelphia return the Ramayana pieces so that the Madanagopala Swami could have a complete set. In a Hail Mary pass that Gravely believed would satisfy both parties, he suggested to Brown that the trustees and devotees might be happy if the Philadelphia Museum offered a full set of replica granite Ramayana reliefs done from photographs. Philadelphia would keep the authentic carvings and take the remaining authentic pieces from India in exchange for giving India this full, shiny new set. Even though the pieces in both Philadelphia and Madurai had already been installed in their respective buildings. It seems that Gravely didn't fully appreciate the idea that views of sacrality and heritage might have changed somewhat during the prior decades as the movement for India's cultural and political independence from Britain escalated. Apparently, he didn't propose the idea of a new set to the Madurai trustees. But even if it had been acceptable, which was unlikely, it was definitely a no-starter for Philadelphia. And that was for a host of practical reasons. Not only had they completed the gallery, cemented everything in, but the moment of interest had passed, and there would have been no way to raise the large sum of money that would have been needed to carve, remove, ship, and reinstall, as well as purchase the stones. And finally, most discussions of decolonization, meaning here prioritizing the perspectives of those once suppressed by colonial domination, assume that present views and emotions mimic or at least reflect those of the past. But when the stones were purchased in 1913, they seem to have been valued not on the grounds of sacrality or heritage, but for the money they could bring the temple, likely helping to build a better home for the goddess. Their antiquity, actually minimal by local standards, seems to have had meaning only for archaeologists and crazy rich Americans. But as the 1920s and 30s progressed, the perspective of local devotees clearly changed. In some ways, they came to share the European archaeological understanding that old things have value because they are old. Even more, the issue is about connection with one's own past, what is today termed heritage. Architectural elements that were once important as parts of sacred structures and had lost importance when separated from those structures became important again, as conveyed by the statement that fragments of old temples should remain in Hindu hands. So what in 1913 had been rubble, valued for the money it could provide to better honor God, by the 1930s had become sacred heritage, valued as expressing both aspects of the divine and group identity. This is only a small part of what the book Storied Stone explores, since it also looks into the period from 1940 to the present and speculates on where we may be going from here, which gets more confusing every day. But this primary point, that a certain amount of fluidity may be the norm for how groups and individuals define and value many objects, is something with major implications for how we approach provenance now and in the future. The full case study of the Temple Hall demonstrates that agency resides, in other words, that being an agent of choice and change resides not only in the colonizer or conqueror, but also in the multiple local as well as trans-regional hierarchies that there is no last page. Trans-regional hierarchies that consider, give me a moment here, sorry about this, trans-regional hierarchies that are responsible for the thinking and the looking and the owning, and that the owning is something that is truly in question here, and I want you to think about what that means. What does fluidity mean? Where do we move from here in terms of legalities? And what is the time that we choose, or that needs to be chosen by all of us around the world to focus on as the moment, if that can be even possible, when we fix a decision about ownership and about heritage. And that is an incredibly complicated and difficult question. And the returners have one opinion on it that seems so simple, and the retainers have another that seems so simple. But as this case study shows, and as the case study on virtually any object shows, not everyone, because some of them are truly stolen and some of them were made in place. But as this case study demonstrates, there is no simple answer. Thank you. I am happy to open this up to the really hard questions or the really easy questions. I'd love to talk. Yes, thank you.
Is there still an ongoing conversation with the temple and the museum?
That's a great question. Is there still an ongoing conversation? Well, I've known both temples and their priests for, a couple of decades now. And they know I brought, the first time I went, I actually brought photographs of what was in Philadelphia and came back with them. And I went together with the priests to look and to try to figure out where these pieces would have come from. In fact, they helped me. I was doing ground plans. They helped me because I'm not allowed into the sanctum. And so they went in with my measuring tape and took measurements for me, and we talked about it. So they've known about this. It's even on their website. And I've sent the book, to them. And so there's that ongoing discussion from the temple itself. They've not asked for the pieces to be returned. They literally, when I first knew them, were pretty much bankrupt. They thought the temple was maybe going to have to close, which often happens with smaller temples in Tamil Nadu. Amazingly, they have actually, in the last 20 years, gotten a great influx of funds that have built up over time, and they have renovated the site. They've actually taken all those loose fragments and built them into smaller shrines around the area. They've paved the main hall with red marble, and it gets huge crowds coming to all of its events now. So things are doing really well. One of my ideas when I was first thinking about what to do and how to make it so that people understood that this was not a dead kind of architecture was to have like a live feed so that almost people could talk to one another. That was back in about 2014, 2015. That didn't pan out, but we did do, with the temple and everybody's permission, we did a video we called A Day in the Life of the Temple at the Madanagopala Swami that really shows how you walk around, many of the events that happen in such a hall, and that brings it alive. And there's an ambient sound of all of this, everything from people singing bhajans to just the sounds of birds early in the morning as people light lamps, to a wedding party coming in. And so there's a way to make that connection. So, yeah, who knows what will happen in the future? Yes.
Thank you for those insight about the temples. I have two questions. One is, how old are these carvings? Number one. Number two, it is very unusual for a tourist to come and buy all these stones. Were they lover of art? Were they lover of religion? Or the lover of fascination that they saw these stones that they need to come to Philadelphia?
Answer to the first question is that they date sometime around 1560. So this was the end of the Vijayanagar Empire, and then the Nayakas were actually the generals for the Vijayanagar Empire, which is at Hampi. And they became independent around that time, and this was probably built by the first of the independent rulers. So stylistically, and by an inscription that's on the building, we know that it's around 1550, 1560. As for the other one, it was incredibly unusual. I mean, people brought home individual sculptures. The British were bringing things all the time, but the idea of taking this vast amount of architecture, yes, there was some that was taken from, kind of fallen down cathedrals in France or Italy or things in the Middle East, Greek and Roman architectural pieces and sculpture. But this was unique, certainly up to that point, and as far as I know, up to the present. And as I say, why they did it, they wanted to decorate their house with something unusual, and they had a lot of money.
Thank you.
Dr. Mason, I have been monitoring our live stream of this lecture on YouTube, and there isn't so much a question as just a comment from a viewer. I am glad that the Marshall family and the Philly Museum saved these columns discarded by the temple. The story is very similar to the Elgin marbles in the British Museum. Great talk, thank you. So, referencing certainly very different, but very much better known.
Yeah, that's a little bit of an explosive comment.
Yes.
Let us say. I'm
Yes.
not even sure I want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Gosh.
It's a very different situation.
It is a very different situation. These, had been taken down from the building. They were discarded rubble. They were not valued at the time. They were sold freely by the temple itself for a purpose. The Elgin marbles were taken off of the standing building, the Parthenon, and, arguing that they could have been better taken care of, in Britain than in the building. I have a real problem with taking architectural pieces off of, or architectural sculpture out of standing monuments. And I have to say, my training is as an architectural historian, and I have been, present or there, gone to a site and come back and seen something smashed off of a wall, and it kills me. And I have to say, I do not see this as a comparable situation to the Elgin marbles.
That was absolutely riveting. I'm so glad all of you were here to hear that incredible lecture. Thank you, Darielle, so much. We have a special memento to give you to thank you.
Goodness.
Thank you again for a wonderful afternoon.
We'll see you in the pavilion for tea and samosa.